Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The morning sun rose slowly over the dusty rooftops of Umuokoro village, painting the clay walls of the Ease family's compound in gold. Amaka stood by the doorway of their one-room hut, pressing her mother's hands against her chest as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her wrapper was faded, her sandals already worn from the journey to come. At just 24, she had the soft face of someone who had suffered quietly but never stopped hoping. Her younger brother, Ikenna, barely 17, stood a few feet away, holding the scholarship letter in his trembling hands. He couldn't stop smiling, though his eyes betrayed the fear of being left behind. Amaka had promised him a future, a life beyond the rice farms and cold classroom benches with leaking roofs. That promise was the reason she was leaving now, to serve as a maid in Lagos. Her aunt had secured the job. It paid just enough to cover his fees. Amaka hadn't slept the night before. She'd spent hours on her knees, praying for strength, not for herself, but for him. She had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, but fate had other plans. Still, she refused to be bitter. Her brother's future had become her own. As the rickety bus pulled up on the narrow dirt road, Amaka hugged Ikenna tightly, feeling the thinness of his back through his shirt. He was still a child in many ways, but with brilliance that outshone even the best in his school. "You must go," she whispered into his ear, where I couldn't. He nodded, biting his lip, and handed her a small woven purse. Inside it was a rosary she had given him years ago. "Take it," he said, "so you'll be safe in the city." Their mother stood by, wiping her eyes with the edge of her wrapper, lips trembling as she prayed under her breath. The village was full of people who had gone to Lagos and never returned the same. Some came back rich, others broken. Amaka didn't know what the city would do to her, but she knew it wouldn't change her heart. She climbed aboard, waving one last time as the bus wheezed forward, dust trailing behind like a curtain over the past. As the road wound out of Umuokoro, Amaka closed her eyes, thinking of Ikenna's smile and the weight of the responsibility resting on her shoulders. The journey took nearly a full day, with the bus rattling through endless potholes and loud Lagos traffic that seemed to scream from every corner. Amaka held tightly to the piece of paper with the estate address written in her aunt's hurried handwriting. She'd never been to Lagos before, only heard stories of its glittering towers and cruel streets. But she wasn't here for the glamour. She was here to wash toilets, sweep floors, and help raise a stranger's child if it meant Ikenna could sit in a university lecture hall one day. As the bus entered the city's heart, surrounded by glass buildings and men in suits, Amaka felt painfully small. But even then, she straightened her shoulders. Her pride wasn't in what she wore or how much English she could speak. Her pride was in her purpose. She didn't know that the house she was heading to would be the beginning of the greatest storm of her life, a storm that would almost destroy her, yet carve from her the very strength she never thought she had. The iron gates of Chief Damilola Adekunle's mansion opened slowly, humming with mechanical grace as Amaka stepped out of the taxi, clutching her nylon bag to her chest. The house loomed ahead, a modern fortress of stone and glass tucked inside a highbrow neighborhood in Ikoyi. To Amaka, it looked less like a home and more like a palace with no soul, too clean, too quiet, too cold. A uniformed security guard took her name, then called inside. Moments later, a tall woman in a red body-hugging dress and pointed heels walked toward the gate, scanning Amaka from head to toe with the sort of look you give a cockroach that just entered your wardrobe. "You're the village girl, right?" "Amaka," she asked, not offering a smile. Amaka nodded. "Yes, Ma. Good morning, Ma." "Follow me," the woman said curtly and turned on her heels. That was Miss Tiniola, Chief Damilola's personal assistant, and the first gatekeeper to the coldest season of Amaka's life. Inside, the air smelled like polished lavender and money. Marble floors stretched beneath her like frozen water, and silence echoed off the high ceilings. No one laughed here. No one moved unnecessarily. Amaka was introduced briefly to a few staff, the cook, a cleaner, and the elderly housekeeper who barely looked up. None of them asked for her story. No one cared. She was shown her room, more of a corner space behind the kitchen, and told to begin duties the next morning. That evening, she caught a glimpse of the mansion's master from the staircase. Chief Damilola Adekunle, a tall, dark-skinned man with commanding eyes and a phone permanently glued to his ear. He looked at her once, nodded slightly, and kept walking. Their first words wouldn't come until later, but Amaka's heart already recognized the chill he carried like a second skin. Yet in that same house lived a boy who would become the only light she had in the days ahead. That night, as Amaka washed her few clothes in a small plastic bowl behind the kitchen, she heard a small cough behind her. She turned and saw him, Toby, a boy of about 8, standing barefoot in his pajamas, holding a stuffed lion. His eyes were big and wide, filled with caution. "Are you new?" he asked, surprising her. "Yes," she said gently, drying her hands. "I'm Amaka. Are you from the village?" "Yes, but I clean very well," she added quickly, unsure what else to say. But Toby smiled, nodding. "Good. The last auntie was boring. You look nice." Then, just like that, he sat beside her on the steps. Amaka felt something shift. No airs. No suspicion. No judgments. Just a child, curious and open. It was the first time she smiled in Lagos. And though she didn't know it yet, that smile would become her undoing. Toby quickly became the rhythm of Amaka's day. He was different, gentle, curious, and sensitive in ways that other children were not. While the other staff tiptoed around him and treated him like fragile glass, Amaka approached him like a friend, not a project. She asked about his favorite cartoons, helped him feed his rabbit, and when he didn't feel like talking, she simply sat beside him in silence. He responded in ways that shocked the household. Toby, who once screamed at every nanny, now followed Amaka everywhere like a shadow. He insisted she read him bedtime stories and hold his hand during his episodes of anxiety. Her village-style patience, calm voice, and affection touched him more deeply than any expensive therapy ever had. But not everyone was pleased. Tiniola, who had taken pride in being the one person Toby would tolerate, noticed the shift immediately. Tiniola began to inject subtle bitterness into conversations. "Be careful around him," she would say to Amaka. "He doesn't like too much touch. Remember, he's delicate. You villagers can be too rough." Amaka would smile politely, bow, and keep quiet. She knew better than to answer back. But Damalola began to take notice too. One evening, as he returned from a long day, he paused in the hallway to hear laughter. Real, uncontrollable laughter. It came from Toby's room. Curious, he stepped closer and peeked in. There was Amaka, dancing like a clown, while Toby rolled with laughter on the bed. The sight stunned him. He hadn't seen his son laugh like that in years. But instead of smiling, a wall rose in Damalola's heart. He was not a man used to affection or things he couldn't control. And a maid getting too close to his son? It made him uneasy. Days passed, and Toby grew more vocal, more expressive. His teachers reported better concentration. Damalola noticed, but didn't say much, only giving cold nods whenever the boy mentioned Auntie Amaka. But deep down, his heart warred between admiration and fear. How could a girl with barely any education, from a village with no electricity, understand his son better than he did? Miss Tiniola, sensing his hesitation, fanned the flames. "Chief," she said one day while adjusting her blouse to expose just enough skin, "she means well, I'm sure. But don't forget, some of these girls have different motives. They're too close sometimes. Too clever." Damalola said nothing, but her words stayed with him. Suspicion was a quiet poison, and the first drops had begun to spread. Nighttime was Amaka's favorite hour. After all the chores were done and the mansion lay in sleepy silence, she would sit by the kitchen window, pen in hand, writing in an old diary she'd brought from a village. She wrote about Ikena, about Toby's daily moods, and sometimes about her own dreams, the ones she buried so that her brother could thrive. She had once been top of her class in biology. Her teachers said she had the mind of a healer, but her father's death and their family's poverty forced her to abandon school. Every kobo now went to Ikena's future. Still, at night, in the quiet of the staff quarters, she let herself feel. Sometimes she would whisper to herself, "One day, I'll go back. One day, I'll wear that white uniform with pride." The pain of sacrifice sat heavy in her chest, but the thought of Ikenna walking across a graduation stage someday made it bearable. Toby's affection for Amaka deepened, and with it, so did her attachment to him. She began to see him as more than just her duty. She saw him as a child in need of emotional safety, not just medication. When he would get overwhelmed, she would sing softly in Igbo, her lullabies gently wrapping around his heart until he relaxed. Toby would sometimes mimic her dialect or ask about her village. He had never known such grounding love. Damalola began to observe this connection more often, Amaka tying Toby's shoelaces, feeding him carefully, or hugging him after a panic episode. It made him uncomfortable, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it reminded him that his wealth and staff had failed where this village girl had succeeded. And something about her, began to stir a deep unease in his chest. He didn't want to admit it, but her presence felt too large for someone he thought so little of. One quiet evening, Amaka sat in the garden with Toby after a mild episode. The boy leaned his head on her lap and whispered, "Do you ever want to do something else, Auntie?" She looked down at him and smiled. "I once wanted to be a nurse, but it's okay. You want to know why?" He nodded. "Because now I get to help you every day. Maybe this is also healing." Toby sat up, thinking carefully. "You can still be a nurse," he said with a confidence that broke her. He reached for her hand and added, "You'd be the best." Her heart trembled. For a brief moment, she forgot about the walls that trapped her, the lies that floated in the air, and the power that hovered over her life. In that moment, only the truth existed, pure, undeserved affection from a child who saw her as more than a servant. It was also the moment Miss Tiniola walked by, unseen, watching from the shadows with envy burning in her chest. Miss Tiniola had never liked Amaka, but now she despised her. In her eyes, the girl was nothing more than a bush girl pretending to be useful. Tiniola, who had worked under Chief Damalola for years, saw herself as more than just a personal assistant. She was his confidant, his fixer, his future, at least in her mind. She had been waiting for him to see her as more than just a polished employee. But with Amaka now stealing quiet glances and Toby constantly speaking her name, Tiniola felt herself being edged out of the only space she held in the mansion. Her mind began to churn with malice. "It's not enough that she has the boy," she told herself. "Soon she'll have the father too, if I don't act." So she started subtly, dropping remarks, twisting facts, and planting doubts like seeds. "Sir," she said one afternoon, while standing by Damalola's office door, "I noticed she's been taking Toby to the kitchen often. Just be careful. These girls get clever fast when they realize who lives here." Damalola didn't say much, but the words lingered. That evening, Amaka accidentally served Tiniola a bowl of egusi that contained groundnut oil, something Tiniola claimed she was allergic to. She collapsed dramatically, gasping and clawing at her neck until the cook rushed in with medication. The incident created whispers among the staff, and Tiniola pointed a trembling finger at Amaka, insisting she had warned her earlier that morning. Amaka, confused and on the verge of tears, apologized profusely, swearing she never received such warning. But the damage had been done. Damalola frowned that night when Amaka walked past him. He didn't speak, just watched her, eyes colder than usual. Amaka sensed it, though she didn't know why. She couldn't sleep that night. Something had shifted in the air, something dangerous and unwelcome. Tiniola didn't stop there. She began taking pictures secretly, snapping moments where Amaka held Toby's hand or fixed his clothes. She sent anonymous messages to gossip blogs with the subject line, "Mansion maid getting too close to billionaire son?" The stories didn't gain much traction yet, but Tiniola was patient. She wanted to create a scandal that would bury the village girl for good. And as the final piece, she began whispering to Damalola that Amaka often entered Toby's room uninvited, that her closeness was becoming unhealthy, even obsessive. "Sir, I just think boundaries should be clear," she said one evening as she handed him his evening coffee. "You never know what someone like her might be planning." The look in her eyes was fake concern layered over deep bitterness. And though Damalola didn't respond, a part of him began to consider that maybe, just maybe, she was right. It rained like the sky had cracked open. Thunder roared over Lagos, and the power grid failed just as dusk melted into night. Inside the mansion, the generator sputtered twice, then died. The backup inverter powered only a few bulbs, none in the upstairs rooms. The house grew still and dim, lit only by candlelight and fear. Toby had always hated darkness. It reminded him of his mother's funeral, of being left in a room alone too long. That night, he had begged Amaka not to leave his side. She promised she wouldn't. She wrapped him in a blanket and sat on the carpet beside him, humming lullabies, whispering stories from her childhood. But as the hours passed and the storm worsened, Toby began to wheeze. Amaka sat up, alarmed. She reached for the emergency kit, but the inhaler wasn't there. Panic set in. Toby's chest tightened. His body jerked slightly, his eyes rolling back. Amaka had seen this before, once with her cousin, Chibuzo, back home. She knew this wasn't just an asthma attack. It was a full seizure. Alone, no phone signal, no staff in sight. She grabbed the menthol bomb from her bag and began rubbing it on his chest. She held his head upright, gently slapping his face, begging him to come back. Toby, breathe. Breathe for me. Her voice cracked with terror. His lips were turning pale. She sobbed loudly, shaking. She didn't know what else to do. Her entire body trembled as she rocked him in her arms, whispering desperate prayers. Her headscarf fell off. Her wrapper loosened slightly. But she didn't care. She was only thinking of keeping him alive. And that was the moment Chief Damalola opened the door. He had returned from his trip early, after a nagging dream about Toby crying alone. No one expected him back. He entered the house silently, moving quickly upstairs when he heard muffled noises. Then he burst into the room and saw Amaka on her knees, bent over his son's body, her hands on his small chest, sobbing, wrapper half loose, sweat dripping from her brow. The scene looked unthinkable. "What are you doing?" he roared. Amaka jumped in shock, her eyes wide, still holding Toby, who was unconscious. He's not breathing, sir, please," she stammered, tears flooding her cheeks. But Damalola didn't hear. Rage exploded from every corner of his soul. He lunged forward, yanked Amaka away from the boy, and in one swift, brutal motion, slapped her across the face. The slap resounded through the room like a whip, cutting through the storm's distant thunder. Amaka hit the floor, her head knocking the edge of the bed frame, eyes wide with terror. Her cheek burned, but what stung more was the look in Chief Damalola's eyes. Disgust, rage, and betrayal. She tried to explain, words stumbling out like broken glass. He was dying, sir. I was trying to save him. Please believe me." But her voice was drowned out by the chaos. Damalola grabbed Toby from the bed, cradling the limp child against his chest, screaming for the other staff. His shouts tore through the house like a siren. The cook and gatekeeper rushed in, confusion written on their faces. Tiniola, always nearby, arrived moments later, pretending shock. "What happened?" she gasped. Amaka looked at her, eyes begging for support. But Tiniola tilted her head slightly and whispered, "You've finally shown your true colors." No one waited to hear. Amaka sighed. Damalola, breathing heavily, still holding his son, barked orders. "Call the police." She was on him, touching him. Tiniola, already dialing, glanced at Amaka with a smirk too subtle for anyone else to notice. The police arrived swiftly, escorted by private security. Amaka was dragged down the marble stairs, barefoot, her wrapper slipping from her shoulder, face soaked with rain and tears. "I didn't do anything," she cried. "He was convulsing. I was helping him." The officers didn't care. Cameras flashed outside. A neighbor had alerted the press. It was all too fast, too cruel. In a matter of minutes, the maid who had once sat in the garden singing lullabies became a public spectacle, shoved into a van as the gates closed behind her. No one asked about the seizure. No one checked Toby's breathing patterns. They only saw what Damalola saw, the scene that lied. Back in her holding cell, Amaka sat shivering on the concrete floor. She hadn't eaten. Her head pounded where it hit the bed. Her arms ached from being twisted by police. But none of that compared to the shame. Her name would be in headlines. Her family would see it. Her mother, already weak from years of hardship, wouldn't survive the news. Her brother Ikenna, he needed her. His school deposit was due next week. Without her salary, he'd lose everything. Amaka clutched the rosary he had given her, now cracked from struggle. "Please God," she whispered, voice breaking. "Don't let this be how my story ends. Not like this." But silence answered her. Silence, and the distant echoes of a city that had already condemned her. The next morning, Lagos woke up to a scandal. Social media buzzed with fury. Billionaires made caught in sick act with child. Village girl exposes real face. Who's protecting our children from help? The headlines ran wild, and most didn't bother with facts. They saw one photo, Amaka being escorted out of the mansion in handcuffs, her wrapper falling off her shoulder, looking like a criminal. Tiniola had sent the tip to several bloggers under a fake name. Within hours, the image had circulated nationally. Talk shows dissected the story, influencers ranted, and society did what it always does. It judged first, listened never. Amaka became the face of shame, her name dragged through every gutter of gossip, her story twisted into a warning. Don't trust the poor. Damalola sat in his office, brooding. His son was stable, recovering at the private hospital. Doctors had diagnosed a mild seizure, likely triggered by stress and weather. He avoided the press, released no statements, and remained silent, still too angry, too blind. His security team confirmed that there was no sign of forced entry, and the cameras had gone out during the power outage. So there was no hard proof of anything. But Damalola's mind replayed the image over and over. Amaka bent over his son, her hands on his chest, her tears wetting his neck. He didn't care about her screams, her explanations. All he saw was a betrayal. All he felt was fury. He had lost his wife to medical negligence. He wasn't going to lose his son to a girl who didn't even finish secondary school. Meanwhile, Tiniola played her role perfectly. She arranged for a press release from the estate claiming that a staff member had been arrested for suspicious conduct. She held meetings with HR citing Amaka's strange behavior in recent weeks. She even forged 2 incident reports from other staff about inappropriate closeness. And Damalola, consumed by his own guilt, didn't question her. Behind closed doors, she celebrated. Amaka was out. Her path was now clear. What she didn't realize, however, was that even lies leave footprints. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a heartbeat. Somewhere it was still breathing. Somewhere someone would listen. In Omuokaro village, the news hit like a hurricane. Ikenna, standing outside the principal's office, stared at the printed headlines on a neighbor's phone, his hands trembling. Maid arrested for abusing billionaire son. The photo of his sister Amaka being shoved into a van, her face stained with tears, nearly knocked him off his feet. His scholarship documents fell from his hand. Inside the office, the principal shook his head. "Ikenna, I'm afraid we can't proceed without the deposit. And with this news, the board may not support your grant anymore." Ikenna pleaded, eyes brimming. "Please, sir, my sister isn't what they're saying. She didn't do it." But no one listened. Reputation is currency, and Amaka's had been burned beyond recognition. Their mother collapsed at the village well later that day, wordless, breathless. A neighbor had to carry her home. Ikenna sat beside her all night, trying to explain what he didn't understand himself. She was trying to help someone, he whispered, but they treated her like trash. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. He called the Lagos number Amaka had given him over and over, but no one answered. She was gone, vanished into a system built to silence girls like her. He walked the red soil roads that night barefoot, looking at the stars. "God," he muttered, "you saw everything. Why didn't you stop it?" His voice cracked as he dropped to his knees. "She gave everything for me. Everything." Back in the detention center, Amaka had stopped crying. Her eyes were dry now, red but hollow. Each time the cell door opened, she looked up, hoping someone would say, "We believe you." But no one came. Her fingernails were chipped. Her voice had gone hoarse. She no longer tried to explain. Even when the investigators came to ask vague questions, they barely let her speak before drawing conclusions. "You should have called for help," one officer sneered. "What kind of maid touches her Oga's son like that?" She tried to say, "There was no light, no phone service. He was dying," but the words never mattered. And yet, in her mind, one thing mattered more than even her name: Ikenna's future. She prayed he had paid his fees. She prayed he hadn't seen the news. She didn't know that miles away, the boy she fought so hard to protect had just dropped his admission letter into a muddy gutter, too ashamed to face the world that had destroyed his sister. The hospital room was sterile and silent, its white walls too clean, too hollow. Toby sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at nothing in particular. The monitors blinked beside him, recording steady vitals, but his lips hadn't moved in days. The doctors called it selective mutism, triggered by trauma. Chief Damalola stood by the window, arms folded, guilt twisted in his chest like a tightening noose. He watched his son, his only son, retreat into a shell he couldn't break. The boy wouldn't speak to the nurses, wouldn't look at the new nanny they brought in. When anyone approached, he turned his face away. Even Damalola, who'd once believed love could be bought with comfort and silence, felt the weight of failure pressing against his throat. He had protected his empire, his name, and his pride, but at what cost? The boy who once giggled at bedtime stories was now a ghost in a hospital bed, and for the first time, Damalola didn't know who to blame except himself. Each morning, the nurses tried to coax him into responding, showing him toys, speaking in soft tones, offering cartoons. Nothing worked. The only name he whispered once in his sleep was Amaka, a soft, broken plea that shattered Damalola's already cracked soul. It echoed in his ears even when he drove back to the mansion at night. He had fired her. No, he had destroyed her. And yet, his son's only light had come from that very girl. He tried to brush it off, convincing himself that Amaka's touch had crossed a line, that he was protecting Toby. But that one name, spoken from the lips of a child who hadn't spoken in days, kept shattering the lie. Tiniola, now emboldened, began taking over more duties, hovering around Damalola with soft words and careful praise. She reminded him constantly, "You did what any father would do. You protected your child." But deep down, even as he nodded, Damalola felt the hollowness of her words. He was protecting something. Yes, but it wasn't his child. It was his ego. One day, Damalola sat beside Toby's bed and tried again. "Son, say something. Please." But the boy only stared at his lion plush toy, clutching it tightly. Damalola reached out and gently touched his shoulder. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you." Toby didn't look at him. Instead, his small hand slowly pushed away the nanny's hand when she tried to feed him. "I want Auntie Amaka," he finally said, barely a whisper, but loud enough to silence the room. Damalola froze. The new nanny gasped. The doctor, overhearing from outside, stopped in the hallway. It was the boy's first full sentence in days. And it wasn't addressed to his father. It was a request for the one person Damalola had buried beneath lies, rage, and pride. In that moment, the billionaire felt like a beggar, powerless, shamed, and utterly undeserving of the trust his son had placed in someone he had wronged beyond measure. In a dimly lit corner of the mansion, Uche, one of the junior IT staff, sat nervously in the control room where all the estate's security footage was stored. Ever since the incident, no one had dared to revisit the system logs. The generator failure had caused a blackout, and most assumed that the crucial footage from Toby's room was lost forever. But Uche knew something the others didn't. There was a backup system, a small solar-powered external drive that was designed to store emergency data in real time. It was meant for accidents or security threats, and no one had remembered to check it, until Uche, battling his conscience, decided to act. He'd watched the press tear Amaka apart. He'd watched Tiniola bask in her new power. But deep in his heart, he remembered how kind Amaka had been to him, how she'd once given him pepper soup when he fell sick and even prayed for him. That kindness refused to let him rest. He retrieved the backup, inserted it into a monitor, and pressed play. His hands trembled as the screen lit up. The timestamp was right, just a few minutes before Damalola had entered the room. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. He saw it all. Toby lying on the floor, convulsing. Amaka rushing in barefoot, her voice full of panic and desperation. He watched as she struggled to hold the boy up, rubbed balm on his chest, and cried over him. There was no malice in her actions, only pure, frantic care. She slapped his cheeks gently, cried for help, and prayed like someone trying to bargain with heaven itself. And then, the sound of the door opening. The camera caught Damalola bursting in. The video ended right before the slap, but the truth was there, etched in motion and time. Uche leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. "Oh God," he whispered, "she was innocent." For hours, Uche sat there, debating whether to speak. He knew what Tiniola was capable of. She could end his job, or worse. But his conscience screamed louder than fear. He copied the footage onto a USB drive and walked to the HR manager's office. "Sir," he said, hands sweating, "there's something you need to see." The man frowned, but took the drive. Minutes later, the room fell into silence as the truth played out. HR called legal. Legal called the CEO's office. And for the first time since the storm began, the tide began to turn. Somewhere in a Lagos prison cell, Amaka sat quietly, unaware that a buried truth had just come alive, and it had teeth. In his office, Chief Damalola sat with trembling hands as his private doctor, Dr. Benson, placed a file gently on the desk between them. "I reviewed Toby's vitals, sir, and I believe you need to read this." Damalola opened the folder, scanning through the handwritten report. His eyes stopped at the words asthmatic seizure, no signs of trauma or abuse, and abrasions consistent with convulsions, not external harm. The room seemed to blur around him. He blinked several times, trying to find a different explanation, one that would justify his anger, his actions, but there was none. The evidence was clear. Amaka had tried to save his son's life. She hadn't hurt him. She had done what no one else had. She had given herself to the moment, heart and soul, even though she was untrained, frightened, and alone. Dr. Benson continued softly, "She may have saved him, Chief. I know her methods weren't medical, but based on Toby's response time and the condition he was brought in, her actions likely prolonged his breathing just enough for us to take over." Damalola closed the file, his jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed him, moist, glassy, and full of regret. "I hit her," he whispered. I humiliated her. I called the police. He couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of what he'd done was collapsing onto his chest like bricks. He stood up, paced the room, fists clenched. "She begged me to listen," he muttered, "and I didn't even let her speak." For a man who had built an empire by making swift decisions, he now saw the carnage of one Maid in blind fury. Later that evening, Damalola sat alone in the garden where Amaka once told stories to Toby under the hibiscus trees. The wind whispered through the leaves like old ghosts. He saw her in his mind, her modest wrapper, her warm smile, her trembling voice the night of the storm. And then he saw her eyes, pleading, broken, betrayed. He remembered the slap, the scream, the moment his son gasped Amaka in the hospital. And suddenly, Damalola fell to his knees in the grass. He wasn't a CEO in that moment. He wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man, crushed by the truth he had refused to see. Somewhere out there, the woman who had saved his child was rotting in a cell, her life ruined by his pride. And now, no amount of money could fix what he had done. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to begin. The day started like any other in the hospital. White walls, quiet footsteps, and the dull humming of machines tracking Toby's vitals. But something had shifted in the air. Toby sat propped up by pillows, his lion plush in his arms, his eyes fixed on the door. For days he had been silent, his voice held hostage by trauma and confusion. But now, something simmered behind his eyes, memories unspoken, truth waiting to break free. A therapist entered and gently took a seat beside him. "Toby, do you remember what happened that night?" she asked softly, almost as if speaking too loudly would shatter him. Toby blinked. His small hands clutched the lion tighter. Then slowly, like a glass unsticking from its shelf, he whispered, "She helped me." His voice was shaky, but clear. "Auntie Amaka, she was crying. I couldn't breathe. She was trying to help." The therapist sat up straighter. Her hands trembled. "Toby," she said gently, "are you sure?" He nodded, this time with a fierceness that surprised her. "She rubbed my chest. She cried. She said, 'Don't die, Toby. Don't die.'" His voice cracked, and his lips trembled. "I was scared, but she didn't leave me. She stayed." Outside the room, Damalola stood frozen. He had come to check on his son, but heard every word from the hallway. His chest tightened, as though the boy's confession had reached into the part of his soul he had buried beneath pride and self-righteousness. Damalola felt tears rising, but he didn't dare move. Each word Toby uttered stripped him further. All the money, the power, the influence, it couldn't undo what he had done to an innocent girl who had saved his son. Later that evening, Damalola walked into Toby's room and sat beside him. Toby didn't look at him immediately, but his hand reached out to clutch his father's fingers. That gesture, small yet profound, was too much for Damalola to bear. "Toby," he whispered, "I need you to be strong, okay?" Toby nodded. "We're going to bring Auntie Amaka home." Toby looked up at him then, for the first time in days, and whispered, "Thank you." Damalola knew that forgiveness from his son would be the easiest to earn. But what about the girl he'd ruined? What about the public shame, the shattered dreams, and the trauma he had caused? That night, Damalola didn't sleep. He reviewed the CCTV footage again. He reread the doctor's report. Then he made a call to his lawyer and said the words he never thought he would say. "Do everything you can to bring her out. I was wrong." While Damalola took his first step toward redemption, another world inside his mansion began to crumble. Tiniola, now enjoying her false elevation, strutted around like the mistress of the house. She sat in on meetings she was never invited to, ordered the staff around, and even suggested changes to Toby's care plan. "He needs less village-style coddling and more structure," she said one morning, filing her nails. But her grip was slipping. Ever since Uche had exposed the footage, the HR department had begun quietly reinvestigating several of her internal reports. The fabricated complaints she submitted, those that described Amaka as unstable, obsessed, and secretive, were suddenly being questioned. One staff member who had allegedly witnessed Amaka's inappropriate closeness with Toby admitted to signing the report without even reading it. "Madam said it was urgent," he confessed, now terrified. "I didn't know it would go public." As more inconsistencies surfaced, so did Tiniola's lies. Uche, encouraged by Damalola's silence and HR's shift in attitude, submitted evidence of altered time logs and message records showing that Tiniola had tampered with the CCTV timestamps before claiming there was no footage. She had gone to great lengths to erase the truth, but it had survived. When a legal team brought the compiled evidence to Damalola, he didn't flinch. He stared at the screen, watching as Tiniola typed out a fake tip to a gossip blog and captioned it, "Let the world know." He leaned back in his chair, shame rolling over him in waves. How had he allowed this? How had he been so blind to her manipulation? When Tiniola was called in for questioning, she arrived dressed in a bright red suit, makeup flawless. But her confidence wavered when she saw the HR team, legal counsel, and Damalola himself waiting. "Tiniola," Damalola said calmly, "why did you lie?" Her voice cracked for the first time. I didn't lie. I only reported what I saw. You altered files. You fed the press. You tried to bury a girl who saved my son." His tone was cold, final. "Why?" Tiniola's eyes welled up. "Because she was taking everything. Your son, your attention. I've been here for years. I waited for you to see me. And then she came from the bush and," her voice broke, "I did it for us." But Damalola's face didn't soften. "There is no us," he said. "There never was." With a nod, he signaled for security. Tiniola screamed as she was escorted out, mascara running, shoes clacking against the marble. Her empire of envy had collapsed, leaving nothing behind but the echo of the girl she tried to erase. When Amaka was finally brought out of the cell, The sky outside was cloudy, as though the world itself was still unsure whether justice had truly arrived. She didn't react when the officers told her someone had posted her bail. She didn't ask who. Her eyes were blank, her face pale from days of fear, cold, and loneliness. The female warden handed her a plastic bag containing her belongings, a torn wrapper, cracked rosary, and the small ID card with her village name scribbled in biro. "You're free," the officer said almost kindly. But Amaka didn't move. She stood there, frozen, heart hollow. Freedom no longer meant anything. She had already been judged, violated, mocked, and humiliated. Her name had been smeared across every blog. Her brother's future had been crushed. And now someone had remembered her? Why now? Outside the station gates, Chief Damalola waited in a dark SUV, the engine humming softly. When Amaka stepped into view, escorted by a prison guard, she looked smaller than he remembered. Her shoulders hunched, her steps unsure. He stepped out of the car, heart pounding. "Amaka," he said softly. She didn't look at him. She stared past him, eyes glazed, lips pressed tightly. "I came. I saw the footage. I know the truth now. I'm sorry," he whispered. Amaka's eyes slowly met his, and what he saw there made his chest seize. Not anger, not tears, just a deep, aching emptiness. "Where were you when I screamed for truth?" she asked, voice so low it barely reached him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? That he judged her? Struck her? Handed her over to wolves, while her only crime was kindness? "I don't want your apology," she said quietly. "I don't even want my job back. I just want to go home." He offered her the car, but she refused. She walked away, barefoot, clutching her bag to her chest, each step heavier than the last. Damalola stood still, watching the girl he had nearly destroyed disappear into the distance. He felt the weight of the title that once gave him pride, CEO, billionaire, leader, crumble into something useless. For all his power, he could not restore her peace. As the car door closed behind him and the SUV pulled away, he didn't speak. He just sat head bowed, replaying the sound of her voice. "Where were you when I screamed for truth?" Again and again. In that moment, Damalola realized that redemption wasn't something he could purchase. It had to be earned, slowly, painfully, and with a heart that truly understood the weight of its own sins. The red soil road leading into Umuokoro hadn't changed. Neither had the broken fences, the children playing barefoot, or the familiar scent of boiled yam wafting from distant compounds. But Amaka had changed. She walked like a ghost of the woman who once left with dreams and hope stitched into every step. Her wrapper clung to her damp body as she dragged her plastic bag down the narrow path, eyes set on the horizon, unblinking. When she reached the front of her family's small hut, she stopped, as if unsure whether she belonged there anymore. Her mother was outside, seated on a wooden stool, holding a rosary and staring at the road as if waiting for something she couldn't name. When her eyes caught Amaka's figure, she gasped, dropped the rosary, and ran toward her. No words were needed. Mother and daughter clung to each other like two halves of a broken jar, their sobs the only language they remembered. Inside, Ikena sat in the corner, his face thin, his school books untouched, his dreams shelved. When he saw his sister, he rose slowly, unsure if it was real. "Amaka," he whispered, voice barely a breath. She turned, her eyes flooded, but she managed a weak smile. "Ikena." That was all it took. He ran into her arms, holding her so tightly it was as if letting go would break the world again. "They lied, Amaka," he cried. "I knew they were lying. I told them." She stroked his back, tears spilling from eyes too dry to cry any longer. But what hurt her most was not the public shame or the physical scars. It was seeing the once ambitious boy now covered in dust, barefoot, helping their uncle in carpentry work just to survive. "I lost the scholarship," he whispered. They said your name was on the blacklist." And just like that, her knees gave out. That night, Amaka sat by the fire outside the hut, staring into the dancing flames. The village had heard of her return, but no one came close. Some whispered, others watched. Only a few women from church brought soup and said, "God sees everything." Amaka didn't speak. She had nothing left to say. She couldn't look her brother in the eye. I ruined his future, she thought. I gave up mine to protect his, and now we both have nothing. She refused to read the newspapers. She didn't care about the world's apologies. What use was the truth if the damage had already stolen everything? She had nothing to hold on to now. No job, no savings, no reputation, and no faith in a justice system that had failed her. She sat there until the fire died out, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the night would take her pain with it. A week had passed since Amaka returned. She barely left the compound, spending her days helping her mother cook, washing clothes at the stream, and avoiding the stares of villagers who now didn't know what to believe. But one afternoon, as she swept the compound, a black SUV pulled up just outside the dusty gate. Her heart jumped. She froze, broom in hand. The driver stepped out, placed a small brown box at the entrance, and left without a word. Cautiously, Amaka approached it. Taped neatly and marked for Amaka ease, it carried no sender name. She opened it slowly. Inside was a sketchbook, the kind children used for drawing. On the first page was a crayon drawing of her, smiling, arms outstretched, with a child in her lap. And next to the drawing, written in large, shaky handwriting were the words, "You saved me, Toby." Beneath the sketchbook was a second envelope, this one bearing a seal from a prominent education foundation. Inside was a printed certificate of scholarship approval for Ikenaese, offering full tuition, accommodation, and a monthly stipend for his university education. Amaka's hands trembled as she flipped to the next document, a handwritten letter from Damalola himself. It read, "Amaka, I know this will never undo the pain I caused you, but I want you to know that I have not stopped thinking about your brother and everything you sacrificed for him. Please accept this small step toward restoring what I helped destroy. There's also a second document below for you." Her hands shook harder as she reached for the second paper. It was a full scholarship, nursing school, any institution of her choice, even abroad if she preferred. The words blurred as tears poured down her face. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened, not from anger, but from something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. She sank to her knees, pressing the letter to her chest, her body trembling with silent sobs. Her mother came running, worried, only to kneel beside her in confusion. "Amaka, what is it?" she asked. Amaka couldn't speak. She simply handed her the drawing, the scholarship letter, and the admission offer. Her mother gasped, covering her mouth. "Jesus! Jesus!" she cried. Ikena, hearing the commotion, rushed over. When he saw the envelope with his name on it, he stared in disbelief, reading it over and over again. "I can still go," he whispered. Amaka nodded slowly. "You can," she said. "You will." That night, they didn't light a fire outside. They lit it inside, with stories, with laughter, and with the quiet understanding that somehow, from beneath the wreckage, a future was growing again. A boy had drawn with crayons the very thing the world had tried to erase, the truth. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the unexpected knock came again. Amaka had just returned from the market, helping her mother stock up on food. She was washing okra when she heard her name being called from the gate. She wiped her hands quickly and stepped outside. What she saw made her heart leap into her throat. Toby, dressed in a light blue shirt, holding his lion plush, stood by the gate, smiling shyly. Behind him was Chief Damalola, standing quietly in a cream native outfit, his eyes avoiding hers, hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, the world froze. Toby ran forward and hugged her legs, whispering, "I missed you, Ani." Amaka's body stiffened. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't prepared for this. Slowly, she reached down and touched his head. "I missed you too," she said, voice cracking. Damalola stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I didn't bring him without asking." He insisted. "He hasn't laughed since you left." His voice trembled, and for once, he didn't speak like a billionaire. He spoke like a father, one who had failed. "We came to say thank you. To say, I'm sorry again. But mostly, to ask if you'd consider seeing us. Talking to us. Not as staff or employer, but as a family that owes you more than words." Amaka looked at him, And for the first time, his eyes held no ego, only regret and longing. She nodded slowly, letting them into the compound. Toby played with Ikena's carved wooden toys, while the adults sat quietly under the mango tree. They didn't talk much, but there was peace. The kind of peace that only comes after a storm that spares you, but humbles you. When it was time to leave, Toby clung to Amaka again. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Amaka looked down at him, brushing hair from his forehead. "You will," she said. "But for now I need to heal too." Toby nodded solemnly and handed her the lion plush. "Keep this, so you don't forget me." Tears stung her eyes. "I could never forget you." As they drove off, Damalola glanced back one last time. She stood at the gate, the lion in her arms, her face unreadable, but no longer hollow. In that quiet afternoon, forgiveness didn't have to be declared. It was understood. It lived in the way she opened the gate, in the way the boy smiled again, and in the way her heart finally began to believe that broken things, when mended right, can shine even brighter than before. Months passed, and Amaka's life quietly transformed. She had accepted the scholarship, not because she needed Damalola's redemption, but because she had earned it through fire and survival. The nursing program was intensive, but Amaka poured herself into it with the same dedication she once gave to washing marble floors and folding children's clothes. She graduated with distinction, her story whispered around campus like legend. She never once told her classmates what had happened, never mentioned the name that had once mocked her on the front pages of gossip blogs. Instead, she walked with humility, often retreating to the campus chapel after exams, lighting candles for the child she once saved and the dreams she almost buried. Ikena, now a second-year student in engineering, often called her at night, updating her on grades, laughing again, dreaming again. Their mother, healed in body and spirit, sold produce with pride, her eyes no longer burdened by shame. Then came the invitation. A new state-of-the-art medical center was opening in Lagos, funded by the Adekunle Foundation, named after Toby. It would offer subsidized care to low-income families and train young nurses from rural communities. Damalola, having stepped back from the boardroom, had found new purpose in building the kind of legacy his son could grow into, not one built on power alone, but on mercy and memory. At the event's opening, journalists gathered, expecting to see the usual business faces. But instead, Damalola stood before the podium and said, "Today is not about me. It's about the woman who saved my son when I was too blind to see her worth." He turned toward the crowd and gestured. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet our new chief pediatric nurse, a woman I am honored to work with and learn from every single day." The audience turned, and there stood Amaka, in a crisp white uniform, stepping forward with quiet grace. Cameras clicked. Guests murmured. Some recognized her. Others stared in awe. But Amaka didn't flinch. She took the microphone, held it for a moment, then said, "This uniform was never meant for someone like me. But maybe that's why it fits." She didn't weep. She didn't boast. She simply smiled, nodded toward Toby in the front row, now beaming, and returned to her seat. The applause rose like a wave. In that moment, it wasn't just Amaka being honored. It was every girl who had been silenced, every village child who dared to dream, every servant whose truth was once ignored. Her name was no longer a scandal. It was a standard. It was spoken now with admiration, with respect, with something deeper than vindication. It was spoken like a seed that had finally bloomed. The story of the maid who had been falsely accused but returned to heal became a national talking point, not because of drama or scandal, but because of the rare silence that followed it. Amaka never filed a lawsuit. She never held a press conference. She declined every TV interview. Her only public statement came months later, during a quiet Sunday evening program hosted by a women's leadership conference. She sat modestly in her nursing gown, hair pulled back, no makeup, no glamour. When asked why she didn't fight back publicly, why she never sought revenge, her answer came after a long pause. Because truth doesn't shout. It breathes. It waits. It stands when everything else falls. The audience wept. Some stood. Others whispered prayers. But Amaka just folded her hands and said, "Love, real love, never hides behind anger." Back at home, Ikenna framed her graduation photo and placed it beside their father's old portrait. Their mother knelt before it every morning, offering thanks not just for survival, but for justice that came without fire, but through quiet dignity. Chief Damalola, on the other hand, never fully forgave himself. But he channeled that guilt into work, building more clinics, writing policies to protect domestic workers, and launching education programs for rural girls. He remained present in Toby's life, but he never again called himself wise. Instead, he let Toby teach him how to feel again. At Amaka's clinic, he sat quietly in the background during health outreach sessions, passing supplies, taking notes, watching her command a space he once thought too high for her to climb. He learned that redemption isn't an announcement. It's a lifetime of serving where you once stood above. One day, after a long shift, Amaka stood at the hospital gate, waiting for a taxi. Damalola pulled up in his car, as he often did. But this time, he stepped out and walked toward her. "May I ask you one more question?" he said, voice calm. She nodded. "Do you forgive me?" She looked at him, long and steady. Then, placing a hand gently over her chest, she said, "I forgave you the day I gave your son that lion plush." He blinked, surprised. "Because I realized I wasn't doing it for you. I was doing it for the child who saw me before you ever did." He lowered his eyes, nodded. Then, as she entered the car beside him, they drove off in silence. No music, no speeches, just the sound of Lagos traffic and the beating of two hearts that had finally, quietly, found peace. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.